the culture in any organization, whether it's a company, a family, whether it's a sports team or a group of friends, that the culture in any group of people has an enormous influence in shaping how people do what they do.
Hi, I'm Matt Egol, host of the CX and Culture Connection, the podcast for leaders looking to drive impact by focusing on their customer experience and culture together. I'm really excited to be here today with David Friedman. I really enjoyed your book, Culture by Design, David, and writing a book review about that. And I'm excited to talk with you about how companies can drive growth and actually make their cultures more scalable. Really looking forward to getting your insights today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Matt. Uh, having worked with as many companies as I have, and I know we'll get into that, one of the things I've found is that smaller companies, it's easy to do culture when you're small. Oh, we got a great group of people and we care about each other a lot and we have this nice thing going. But as you've, I'm sure, seen in your career, as companies grow, how do they make their culture more scalable? How do they make sure they don't lose the things that were really important to them when they were small and not lose that as they get bigger? And I know we're going to talk a lot about how to do that today.
Yeah, I think what's really exciting about our conversation is you're involved with companies at an earlier stage than I've often worked with. You and I have talked how, we both share a passion for culture, and we've come at this from different angles. Like I was part of the team at Booz and PwC, the Katzenbach Center, which focused on culture. But we often work with bigger companies that, in many ways, like you're talking about, their strengths became their weaknesses, or they overplayed strengths, and the bad behaviors crept in, and eventually the culture was a challenge rather than an asset. And what you're working on is how to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Yeah. Bigger companies have just so much more complexity to them, but smaller companies have a different dynamic where my experiences, having worked with mostly entrepreneurial companies, you have a founder and he or she started this company and they have a passion for what they're doing and a passion for their people. And just because of who they are, it isn't even a strategy for them so much. It's just who they are. They take care of their people and they have this passion for how we do things around here. And we care about each other deeply. And, there's a lot of discussion these days about whether a culture is a family or it's not a family. But a lot of them talk about, we think of each other like family. We have this close-knit thing. And they worry about, as we get bigger, how do we make sure we don't lose that? Because that was an advantage for us. Most of them would say that people came to us because of our culture and they stayed with us because of our culture. And now we're twice the size or three times the size, or maybe we made an acquisition and now we're worried about how do we lose that? Or I'll give you another example, beyond even just growth, a lot of companies, especially smaller ones, but this happens for larger too, will say, we were great when we were all together, but now we're all working remote or we're hybrid. And how do we make sure we don't lose that special sauce that we had when we were together now that we're working hybrid? And that's the kind of stuff that I work on.
Yeah, I think this hybrid thing is an important one where a lot of the times people lose sight of the fact of the informal side of culture. And a lot of companies focus on like the formal side of organization, like who reports to whom and who has decision rights and what are the incentives or what are the metrics they track. And those all can all matter. But the informal side is super important, which is like the mindsets and norms and the behaviors and how stuff really gets done around here. And a lot of that gets spread through informal interactions that people used to have around the proverbial water cooler. And it takes a lot more intentional focus on it when you're remote.
Well, I think that's right. And I think the biggest impact that being remote had or has had on culture is it's meant that it's required people to be more intentional, to use your word. That, to your point, when we were together, there was the water cooler conversation and the way that we just related to each other. And whether it's a small company or a big company, as people went remote, and that's not happening, that being together at the water cooler isn't happening anymore, there better be something more systematic, something more structured, something more intentional to make sure we don't lose that stuff that we used to get at the water cooler.
What you're highlighting is there are different reasons why. I mean, you and I would say there's always a good time to talk about culture. There's never a bad time to talk about culture, but there often are reasons why executives get engaged in culture. Either there's some acquisition that they've made that causes them to think about integration and how to make sure it doesn't go off the rails, um, or there's some other major change initiative. A lot of my work historically is been on driving, more innovation, more customer centricity, more agility, and there's a big initiative, and we make sure that we address culture as one of the work streams. So that's how I got more involved in this topic. Or there's a company that wants to get into hypergrowth, or they want to get to the next wave of growth, and this is an opportunity to make sure they don't screw it up as they grow, right? What do you see as the most likely kind of trigger events or things that lead people to want to look at culture?
Yeah, I think in my experience, there's a handful, and you've named several of them. So sometimes it's um, just growth and the impact that growth is having on them or that they fear will have on them as they grow, and they don't want to lose what they had. Sometimes it's um, challenging workforce that everybody's competing. I've never seen in my entire career, I've never seen a labor market that is difficult as it is today, where every one of our clients and prospects is saying, it's so hard to find good people today. So how do I make sure that I can find the best people and attract them? And how do I make sure I don't lose them? Sometimes it's we went remote. We were together and now we're remote and we're worried about losing what we had. Another thing that I see, particularly among entrepreneurial companies, is that sometimes there's a change in leadership. Maybe they're moving from one generation to another. There was grandpa, and then there was my dad who ran the company, and now I'm taking over, passing it to my son or daughter. And how do we make sure we don't lose the things that grandpa stood for when he started this company 50 years ago? Um, and even if it's not a family business, there can still be changes in leadership. If the CEO and founder is now in his or her 60s, they're thinking about, well, how do I bring in the next group? And how do I make sure that that next leadership still retains the things that made us successful and got us to this point? So those are some of the things that I see that cause a leader to say, we want to focus on this.
So I'm going to ask a question that may seem obvious, especially with two guys who love to talk about culture on a podcast with the word culture in the name, which is why is culture so important to help companies achieve their growth potential?
Yeah, I mean, it may seem like an obvious question, but I think it's really important to address. And there's so many ways to look at that. But I would say as a starting point that the culture in any organization, and we can broaden this conversation, the culture in any organization, whether it's a company, whether it's a family, whether it's a sports team or a group of friends, that the culture in any group of people has an enormous influence in shaping how people do what they do. I've always said that in my experience, any of our listeners, if you think about your own company that you may run or just work in, that you could place team members on a very typical bell curve. On one end of the spectrum, there are always some people who are going to stand out. It doesn't matter what environment you put them in, the worst environment, and they're still going to be great. And I love those people. I call those people rock stars. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's always a few people who just aren't going to be very good. I don't care where you put them. But in between, my experience is that the vast majority of people, I'm going to call it 80% of people, will conform to the environment that they find themselves in. That you could put the same people, take 80% of them, and you put them in a high-performing championship kind of team where we have high standards and where people do things in a certain way, and most 80% of those people are going to conform to that environment and raise their play. And you take the exact same people. I don't care what their skills, talent, knowledge, ability, experiences, put those same people in a low-performing environment, 80% of them will sink to the level of the people in the environment because the environment has that much influence.
I agree. I was recently fortunate to attend a parents' weekend at Duke, where I'm outnumbered at home. My wife is an alum, and I have two kids at Duke. I did not go to Duke, but I really am proud of them and enjoy everything about the school. And I got to see Coach K talk, and he's a great leadership teacher, a great leadership coach. And he's at the Fuqua School. But he came and did a conversation for over an hour with John Feynman, who wrote a book called Five Banners. And it's out now. It's a really great book. It's a fun book, even if you're not like an avid Duke fan. Like it's a really good book about their five championships. And the one thing he just has quote after quote after quote when you listen to him talk. And one that really stood out for me, David, is he said the four most powerful words in the English language are "I believe in you." And he talked about belief and how important it is to culture. And in the book, what you see is that Coach K got the people to see themselves as a championship team. And the way they worked together and everything he did influenced their belief in each other.
Yeah. I on my own podcast, which is called Culture Architects, I've interviewed a number of coaches. So I interviewed at the University of North Carolina. So Matt Doherty, who played with Michael Jordan and was a big disciple of Dean Smith, and it was National Coach of the Year one year at UNC. And he talks about Dean Smith doing the same thing that Coach K did, that there was a way that we did things here. I've also interviewed also at University of North Carolina. Anson Dorrance is a legendary coach for soccer. He coached the women's soccer team, and they won, I think under his tutelage, they won 21 national championships. Forget 5 banners, 21 banners. And so if you win 21 national championships, you figured out a couple of things. He's also a big disciple of Dean Smith. But the point is, he created this environment, this culture that caused players to come in. And granted, just like Duke, they're attracting the best players. But so are the other top 10 or 20 schools. So we're not comparing Duke or UNC to, some no-name school. They all have top programs, but some programs turn those players into higher performing people than they would be elsewhere. And that's driven by the culture. The culture affects everything. And so my point of view is, and I know yours too, if we understand that kind of impact, the kind of impact that culture has on everything that happens, why would we leave that to chance? Why wouldn't we as leaders say, I'm going to purposely create that championship culture that would cause players or team members or whoever to come into our environment and raise their standards, to raise their performance? That would be such an obvious thing to do, and yet most don't.
So, there's a lot of that's been written. And one of my favorite expressions is like culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Which I think is attributed to Peter Drucker, even though he said something else. But and then this really talks about how hard it is to change culture, but how important it is to any successful change initiative to pay attention to culture. So I'm interested, you can evolve a culture and you can introduce new behaviors and kind of dampen negative behaviors. How do you think about creating a culture, given how important it is, yet how hard it is to introduce totally new behaviors into an organization? Evolution versus change the culture.
Well, it's funny. I don't think it's as hard as people make it sound. Having done it for more than 800 organizations, I think people make it harder than it needs to be. It's not that complicated. And I think sometimes we overcomplicate things. So to me, the starting point, I think, in simplifying this is that I see culture through a behavior lens. And what I mean by that is that, to me, if you ask, what is the culture in an organization or any group of people, it's the way they behave. I don't care about all the things that they believe in and all the things that they say is important to them. What are the observable behaviors that I see that this is how we do things around here? That, to me, that's what the culture is. It's the way we do things. So if we look at it from that perspective, the reason I'm so big on seeing culture through a behavior lens is that as long as we keep calling culture all of these fuzzy things. So if you ask a lot of people, so what is culture? I mean, that question comes up a lot. What is culture? What do we mean by that? You will hear a lot of things people say like, well, it's kind of like the feeling you get when you're here, or it's the atmosphere, or it's the environment. And it is all that stuff. It is. But what do you do with any of that? Okay, your culture is the environment. So go fix the environment. I don't know how to do that. As long as we start to see culture, as soon as we start to see culture as behavior, people have been studying behavior change for thousands of years. This isn't new. This isn't a complicated thing. Behavior change is pretty black and white. I mean, not black, it's nuanced, but it's clear what to do about it. And so as soon as we see culture as behavior, I can affect behavior change. And in the system that I teach, there's a framework that I call the 8-step framework for how you do this. But there's 2 of the steps that really drive 90% of the impact, and they're just about behavior change. The first of those steps is, and this is pretty obvious, but we have to define, well, what are the behaviors that I want this culture to be? And to a certain extent, I don't care what they used to be. All I care about is what do I want them to be? Some of them maybe we do now well, and some we don't, but I have to define with enough clarity what exactly is the culture I'm trying to get. What are the behaviors that I want to see people doing that if all of our people were doing this, we'd say that's the culture we're looking for. Once we have that clarity, we have to create a structured, systematic way to teach those behaviors and practice those behaviors over and over and over and over again. No different than a basketball team at Duke or a soccer team at North Carolina or any other organization. We don't live these because we wrote them down one day. We live them because we practice them. And if you can define what you want and you create a structured way to practice them over and over and over again, people will start to do them. It's not that complicated.
I agree with you. I think the single most important thing in understanding culture is the behavior. What are the behaviors that are good today? What are the behaviors that are bad today? Everything else doesn't matter unless it translates into behavior ultimately, right? And so a lot of people focus on values and mission statements, and those are useful to build shared mindsets. But unless you translate them into behavior, you're not going to have any impact in changing the culture.
Yeah. And I see so many companies that have these wonderful statements of all the things they believe in. And they're true. I mean, and they're authentic. They're true for them. And there's some that aren't very authentic, but there are many that they are true. I believe in these things. But at a certain level, who cares? And I don't mean that in a dismissive kind of way. But to your point, all I really care about is what do people do? How do they actually show up every day? We could believe a whole lot of things and we could value a whole lot of things, but what matters is how do we show up? That's at the end of the day what counts the most.
Yeah, and it's like habits. It really is habit building, and it's unconscious thought for the most part and connection to emotion. But you can, the expression going from conscious incompetence to conscious competence to unconscious competence, it's basically habit and practice.
Yes, that's all it is. So go back to this thought that I've introduced, at least, that getting culture how you want it to be. I was going to say changing culture, but sometimes it's not changing it. Sometimes it's institutionalizing what we already have. Other times it could be changing it. So I'll just describe it as getting it how you want it to be, whether that's change or not. If we understand then that this is really about behavior, and we know that the way you institute behavior change is by having clarity about the behaviors, and to your point that you've just made, practicing it, creating habits, making it habitual. Well, this isn't that complicated. We define what we want and we create a structured way to make it habitual. Do that, and you're going to start seeing people internalize the behaviors that are important.
Yeah, emotion is actually the operating system of the human brain. And most people do things because how it makes them feel or how it makes others feel. And you don't have to think about it. You just do it, right? And so I like to think that behavior leads to emotion and vice versa. But like people basically behave a certain way, it becomes habit, reinforces that craving and that behavior. And then the emotion leads to an outcome. The emotion gets you an outcome. And so whether it's customer experience or employee experience, you have to understand the behaviors. And also, what I like to layer on top, though, also is like that peak in a journey, whether it's the customer journey or the employee journey, the peaks occur where the emotions are strong. And its specific behaviors actually evoke certain emotions that's the glue between customer experience and culture, is understanding the behaviors that actually get you those peaks.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes some sense. When I think about a company, I mean, there's examples of small companies and large companies that do this well. But I learned a lot of what I teach from an experience that I had many years ago. I wrote about it in the book with the Ritz-Carlton hotel chain. And actually, on my podcast, I interviewed Horst Schulze, their founder, and why he created what they do. And talk about customer experience. They do it like nobody's business. They're pretty darn good at this. But what I had learned, a quick story of this for your audience, my first company was an employee benefits consulting company. And we were really good at it. We were great at customer service, but I wanted to figure out how we could be better. And I planned a particular day where I closed my office. I chartered a couple of buses and I loaded everybody in my office, over 100 people, onto these buses. And we drove to Center City, Philadelphia, which is not far from where I live. And we went to the Ritz-Carlton. And my plan was we were going to have lunch there and we are going to spend the afternoon in a meeting room doing some brainstorming about amazing service. And I didn't know at that time how they did their service. I just knew they were great. And I figured it couldn't have been luck. There had to be a system for how they did it. And so I ended up asking someone there if they could come and maybe during lunch, share with us some of their behind the scenes practices. And what I learned are two very critical things at Ritz-Carlton. One is that they had defined the behaviors that were important for them. They call them their basics. And they have 20 of them, and they were numbered 1 through 20 on a little laminated card. So they defined to your point, they defined the behaviors that would lead to the customer experience that they were trying to create. And these were called their 20 basics. But what was maybe as important, if not more important, is they had created a structured way to teach them that in every Ritz-Carlton property in the world, every day in every shift in every department, the team members get together at the beginning of the shift and have what's known as a daily lineup. And part of that daily lineup each day is a discussion of the basic of the day. So today's basic number 1 and tomorrow's 2 and next day's 3 and 4. So there was a structure to how they teach this over and over and over again. And if today's day number 16, it's day number 16 in every Ritz-Carlton property in the world today. They've got something north of 40,000 employees around the world. And today, every single one of them is in a daily lineup and they're talking about the same basic. I heard that, that just struck a chord with me. I heard that 23 years ago on that day that I was introducing things to my team. And it just, when I heard it, it just resonated with me. It just made sense. And I began to think, well, what is it that they're really doing? I mean, why does this work so well? And from that, just contemplating that, reflecting on that, I thought the idea of defining those behaviors was game-changing to me, as obvious as it is in retrospect. So I went home and I started to think about, if I had basics like they do, behaviors, what would some of my behaviors be? And I wrote out my list of behaviors. I chose to call them fundamentals. That's what we call them in our world, but same thing. They're just their basics, my fundamentals. And I created, where they have a daily structure, I created a weekly structure of ritualistic practice, where every week we focus on one and we work on it, practice and talk about it and teach about it and tune up our awareness about it. And if we do that this week for number 1 and next week for 2 and the next week for 3 and so on, and we cycle through them over and over and over again, just like Ritz-Carlton did, that gives us the practice, the repetition that you're referring to, that leads to the internalization. And so, they do it with 40,000 people over the world. If it works for them, it's got to be able to work for me. It's just taking the same concept.
There's a great metaphor I learned early in my career doing some work with a metals company, a steel company. Someone told me that when you roll metal flat, it wants to bend back. Right? So you have to keep rolling it flat to get it to stay flat, because it remembers it wants to change back. This stuck with me as a metaphor for change management. You're right. You can change a culture. It just requires rolling it flat multiple times. requires persistence. Eventually, it will stay flat if you repeat the behaviors and people learn them. What you're highlighting, David, is the importance of ritual as a really, and I would extend that slightly to ritual is a great way to drive habit building because it's, as James Clear, he wrote the book Atomic Habits, which people, I've read it many times, and I recently included it along with your book, Culture by Design, as one of the ones I reviewed, and people can find them in the book reviews page on JourneySpark's website. I really recommend David's book, and it's one of the first 20 books I reviewed, your book on my site, which I really enjoyed it. But James Clear talks about the importance of habit stacking, that you attach a habit to other habits. And the beauty of attaching habits to rituals is you do them all the time and it's not hard to get people to do them.
Yes. I love that book. It's one of my absolute favorite books. And I use the word ritual, routine, habit kind of interchangeably. I use the word ritual, but I mean the same thing that James Clear is talking about. And one of my favorite quotes from that book is he said, I'll see if I can get this quote exactly right, but I think he said that we don't rise to the level of our goals. We sink to the level of our systems or our habits or our routines, that ultimately we get success by creating habits of things. And the reason for that, from my perspective, is that it's our nature as human beings that most humans stink at sticking with things. We're just not very good at it. We come up with the new diet and exercise program. Every January, every gym in the region is mobbed because everybody's this is the year we're going to get healthy. And by February, they're back to their normal levels of activity. We're just not good at sticking with things. Rituals, habits, routines, whatever language you want to use, are the mechanism that enable us to continue doing repetition because we get bored. We're going to quit. When it becomes a ritual or a routine or a habit, it's not hard to do. You don't struggle to brush your teeth in the morning, I hope. It's just part of your routine. So once it becomes part of the habit, part of the routine, part of the ritual, that's what keeps the repetition happening in the face of our normal mode of getting bored and quitting. And the repetition is what's necessary to get it internalized.
I agree that if you had to pick one thing to make habit building easier to do, ritualizing is the top of the list. 100% agree, hands down. Beyond that, why stop there? But there's an 80-20. Like if you had to pick one thing, do that. If you want to pick other things, I think there are other things you can do that are relevant for many organizations to build some habits. I'd love to talk a little bit more about what else can you do to build habits beyond rituals?
Well, I think when we talk about defining, and I use those words kind of interchangeably, rituals and habits, so they're almost the same in my mind. But so the question is, how do we embed these things in a way that's going to last? And I think that there are a couple of key principles to think about. And I think to a certain extent, they mirror a lot of what James Clear talks about in Atomic Habits. But first principle you refer to is habit stacking. Look first for what do we already do and how can I fold this into what we're already doing? The more new things we have to create, the more impediments there are to success. The more we can leverage what's already there, the easier it is. So a simple example of that, in my company and most of our clients, every meeting that we have in our company, the first agenda item of the meeting is our fundamental of the week. And we spend the first 3 to 5 minutes talking about it. We don't establish a new meeting. There's no new meetings. We're just leveraging a meeting we're already sitting in. That's pretty darn easy. That takes no extra time. We're already there. So that's the same as James Clear's habit stacking. Look for what do we already have and how could I fold this into something we already have? Second thing I would say as a principle around how do you do this is the easier it is to do, the better. And what I mean by that is sometimes there's a tendency, especially with a new program, to be really excited about all these amazing things we can do. And it gets too hard to do because it's too much work. And so I often say this is one of those places where the repetition is more important than the quality. In other words, I would rather us have a conversation about our fundamental of the week or whatever tool somebody's using, I'd rather do that every single day in a conversation that wasn't as deep and as meaningful than having this amazing, incredible, in-depth conversation that took 30 minutes and we quit after 3 weeks. So, if it's not going to last, it's not going to work. So the more work it takes to do it, the less likely it's going to be to last.
I think that behavior in an organization is there's a distribution. I like to think of the bell curve and the triple double as a phrase that Chris Taylor, who was on my podcast, he's the CEO of Actionable, and they have a platform that I use for behavior adoption. The triple double, you think of it as like a bell curve, David, where the people in the middle are engaging some of the behaviors some of the time. And not everyone necessarily does everything all of the time. Then the people on the right side of the bell curve are doing the behaviors all of the time, all of the behaviors all the time. They're the ones you want to hold up as examples for everyone else. And the ones on the left of the bell curve do none of the behaviors none of the time. Hopefully there aren't that many of them. That those are hiring mistakes, right? Now you want to shift the curve, right? And so the question is, how do you get more people to do more of the behaviors more of the time? Ritualizing is a great way to do that. Another way to do it is there natural occurrences where you spot people, and you call this out in your book, where you see it in the moment and it's a teachable moment. That there's lots of those moments where people can teach others, hey, this occurred, and instead of doing this, you should do this. Or I did this, and next time I want to do this. And I think that there's actually things you can do also to get people to practice and be self-aware of their behaviors, where you get them to, check in and reflect on a behavior they've committed to practicing. And they practice it for, 45 days. They'll have it at the end of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's why, not to keep coming back to rituals and habits, but it's what drives success. It's the repetition that creates the self-awareness. So I may have seen you do something good or bad and given you some coaching about it, and that could be a great moment, but the memory of that discussion may not last. If we talk about it over and over and over and over and over and over again, it starts to be so present in your mind that we're increasing the chances that it's going to last. That habit is going to, that the new behavior is going to start to take root and start to become, the way you do things now. And so it's repetition.
I'd like to connect this back for the audience, if you humor me for a minute, to customer experience a little bit more. Lots of companies, let's take the simplest example in the call center. They record the calls, people watch calls, and then they give coaching on calls. This is a prime opportunity to identify the behaviors you want and to actually observe people and then give them coaching about when they didn't engage in the behaviors, what should they have done instead, and show them where they do it well, show them where they could improve. Also to get people to make commitments for which behaviors they want to work on, and then have them practice them and be self-reflected. Just keep a diary or do a check-in and see, how's it going? And then focus your coaching efforts on the places people need to improve. You can then also connect your customer listening back to this. And actually, once you know what behaviors you want, you can actually listen for them in the way you mine the text.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a whole lot of sense that you're targeting the behaviors that are most important and giving people coaching about them. And we keep talking about behaviors, and appropriately so, because it all starts with that clarity. If you're going into, let's just talk about it from a coaching standpoint as you're identifying, if I were a manager or supervisor and are coaching one of my team members in that call center, and I've never been very clear about exactly what are the behaviors I'm wanting you to exhibit on these calls, how am I going to be an effective coach? And yet it's remarkable how rare it is that people are that clear. How can I coach if I don't get that clarity to start with?
There's one company, I won't use names on the podcast, and feel free to use names if you want on your own examples, but I won't use their name without their permission. but it's a consumer electronics retailer, and they get lots and lots of calls. And we actually identified that the emotions you want in the call are to people to feel relaxed, supported, confident, and optimistic. And there's like a crescendo as you go through the experience to go from calming down to being optimistic about engaging in the category. And what's fascinating is it's the behaviors of the people that get people to feel that way. And in fact, there's a huge statistical fit of when these emotions were present, these behaviors were present, and when these emotions are present, they get the right outcome. Um, and they can start practicing. This changed the way they think about training. But just getting intentional, like you said, first you got to start with what are the behaviors?
Yep. If we don't have that, we don't have the starting point. And then once we have that, now it's just a question of what are all the different ways that we can teach and coach people on that so that there's so much repetition in our messaging around that it just becomes the way we do things around here.
Yeah, and I don't want to imply that this is just the call center. On the contrary, what David and I are talking about, this applies across the entire organization. And in the principles that we're talking about here, they apply for sales, marketing, service, anything that touches the front line. But it also, those are more direct behaviors with customers. It also applies indirectly, the way people collaborate and work with each other inside the organization.
Yeah. As I've thought about, again, I call them fundamentals, those behaviors. My experience is that when you look at a set of fundamentals, they will tend to fall into one of four categories. Now, we don't end up categorizing them like this, so we don't say, all right, well, these are this category, that category. But if you're brainstorming, you're thinking about them, to your point, some of them, a large number of them, will relate to that customer experience. This is how we treat customers. Some number of them will relate to how we treat each other. How do we collaborate? How do we share information? How do we work together? Some number of them will be more personal about my work, the pride that I take in the work that I do. It may not affect anybody else, but how do I look at my work? And then there's a fourth category that tends to have to do with people's attitude. Are we, am I positive? Am I optimistic? Do I have humility? Those kinds of attributes that still turn into behaviors. So I have found I never designed them this way, but if I just look at them and if I were to map them, they tend to fall in one of those four categories.
I love that. I tend to focus just on what I call like direct or indirect, but I like your pride builders. That's what we used to call them at the Katzbach Center. And the mindsets or kind of the orientation people have, those really define the traits of the organization.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. I mean, if you use it just as one example of that, there's a fundamental that that's in many of our clients, including my own company. It's a mindset in your language that we call assume positive intent. And it's about starting situations and interactions from the assumption that most people are good people. They want to do the right thing. Give them the benefit of the doubt. And now let's talk about how I'm going to deal with them. That's a completely different mindset than everybody's out to screw you. And you just can't trust people because you know how people are these days. And those will elicit completely different responses. And so there are some behaviors fundamentals that do relate to our attitude, our mindset, how we think about things, and they affect people in a powerful way.
Yeah. So I'd like to come back for a minute to this kind of breadth versus depth question that I agree with you that culture is broad and that it's CEO led and that it affects everything in the company. Right. And then I think you and I have talked about this and you have this in the book that basically you want to approach culture holistically to have the most impact. Right. On the other hand, as in maybe this is a timing question or maybe it's situational. In many cases, companies make choices about where to focus for their energy in order to have impact. Where, in some cases, in my experience, culture is picked up as we want to be more innovative or we want to drive better customer service, or which tends to push you into a subset perhaps of the fundamentals, right? So what's the trade-off between staying broad and going deeper? And when do you go deeper to kind of have the right impact?
That's a good question, Matt. And the way that I would think about this and do think about this is I start broad because there's a foundation of how we want our company to be. Yes, we want certain results to come out of that that may be responsive to a particular need at this moment, whether it's better customer service or more innovation or whatever. But there's a foundation upon which we're building this company. I think about another favorite author. I'm sure you've read all of Patrick Lencioni's books. Um, and in Patrick Lencioni's book, The Advantage, he talks, that's the only book I think he's written that's completely nonfiction. It's kind of, I think it's kind of like a summary of his other books. And the subtitle of that book, it's called The Advantage, Why Organizational Health Trumps Everything Else in Business. And what he says in there is that in his view, at least, that what it takes to be successful is you got to be what he calls smart and what he calls healthy. Smart being the traditional business disciplines, finances, operations, sales, all that stuff. Health being a highly functioning group of people. And he says, and I tend to concur with this, and it's why I'm sharing this in response to your question. He says that the health of a company acts as like a multiplier effect, that for whatever given level of strategy, product, service, whatever it is that you have that you're offering in the marketplace, whatever initiatives, whether your initiative is we're going to improve customer service or we're going to drive more innovation or whatever our initiative is, we're going to go 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 10 times as far on that initiative if we've got a highly functioning group of people, and we're going to go a fraction as far on that initiative if we've got a screwed up, dysfunctional group of people. So to me, getting the culture how I want it to be is a foundation upon which every other initiative is built. And that's why I see this in a broader way, that I want to define what are the behaviors I want this company to be about, and how do I want this culture to operate? And if I get that right, it will enable me to implement the new thing we're trying to do in customer service, or the new thing we're trying to do in innovation, or the new thing we're trying to do in any other part of our company. It's the foundation upon which everything else is built.
I agree. And that's why my own book and podcast are both the CX and culture connection, because I don't think you can have impact on CX unless you address this foundational issue. And what you're highlighting is, in some cases, rather than just pick up CX, we call this reframing the problem. Maybe you want to reframe it. There's a broader issue than just the issue you're solving if you need to fix the foundation on the culture.
Yes. And I would say even beyond fixing the culture, because again, in many cases, it isn't, at least you and I may think it needs fixing. Sometimes the leader doesn't think it needs fixing. He or she may be really proud of what they have, but we still want to strengthen it. We want to institutionalize it more deeply. We want to make sure we never lose it. So it could be in response to something that needs fixing. It could also be, we just want to strengthen it and institutionalize it more powerfully.
I agree. I liked your fundamental about first assume good. My basic premise on culture is that any negative behaviors that exist in the culture are a result of overplaying strengths. There was something happening before that was good that ultimately leads to bad behaviors that creep in around the same traits that crowd out the good behaviors. But I believe in human goodness. Now, there are bad behaviors, but I don't think companies have systematic hiring mistakes and bad strategy where they're just screwed up. No, they usually mistakes occur because it's an unintended consequence of something else that was good.
Yeah. And what's so fascinating about that, then that fundamental, is, to your point, we kind of know that intellectually, and yet we act as if it's the opposite. Somebody does something that was bad, and I can't believe that jerk. And we like, did you really think that person woke up this morning deciding, I'm going to make your day difficult today? No, that they had a good intention. That, to your point, that there was a good reason behind it, and it got messed up or for whatever reason. But the impact of assuming positive intent, of assuming that they were probably trying to do the right thing, is it changes how I approach them about it. If I come to you and say, I know we probably wanted the same thing, and I know that you were looking to help that customer as well. It didn't work out. Let's take a look at what happened and what we need to do differently. That's a very different conversation than, I can't believe you screwed up that thing. Look what it did to the customer. As if you were trying to do that in some way.
Well, David, I really enjoyed our conversation. I know you've sparked ideas for me, and I know you have for the audience as well. I could keep going asking more questions, but I know we're coming up on time. If and I really look forward to. I think a lot of the smaller companies that I work with, I think I would really benefit from collaborating with you. So I look forward to taking our relationship further in the future.
It'd be my pleasure, Matt.
Yeah. So what can people do to if they want to get in touch with you in terms of websites or LinkedIn or so forth?
Yeah, best places to look. So my website is called CultureWise, like the word culture and WISE, culturewise.com. So email's david at culturewise.com, or the website is culturewise.com. There are lots of videos there, lots of explanations, all kinds of material there for people to dive in more. My books are fundamentally different, and Culture by Design, as you've referenced. Culture by Design, there's two editions of that. There's the first edition and the second edition I released a few years ago when the pandemic came out, and it updates the first edition to include information about the remote and hybrid work environment. So people should look for the second edition. All those books are hardcover, softcover, ebook, and audiobook. They're available on Amazon and on Audible.
Thank you so much for your time, David. Really enjoyed it.
My pleasure, Matt. Great to be with you.